Okay, this is Delphina Bailey Nichols, and this video is about polygamy and my new video series that's during the period of the flower blood supermoon, which is the first of 4 consecutive supermoons. Um, and this first one also coincides with second Passover, also referred to as Pesach Sheni. All right, so I'm going to get into the mechanics of how polygamy worked in the old days and why some of the reasons why it conflicts with modern lifestyles in nations that tend to have better access to food, better finances, more advanced technology, and also more military power. All right, I'm going to get into why that lifestyle is often not very compatible with our way of life here. So, one of the mystics of India called Sadhguru, also known as Jagi Vasudev, he gives a very, very well balanced um, teaching on polygamy and why it was beneficial in more primitive times versus why it's actually very detrimental now in modern times in most cases. Okay, and one of the main points he brings up is that in times of war, women had to wait for years at a time for their men to come home, and men just kind of got hooked on that romantic idea of having one woman or more than one woman back home waiting for them. And so polygamy was something that people adopted to balance out the ravages of warfare. But what I believe has happened is that it not only got men addicted to that lifestyle of forcing women to wait even when it's not necessary, um, and I think it got them addicted to it. I also think they started turning the number of females waiting for you back home into a kind of status symbol to display how manly or popular or wealthy they are. And I think the culture of warfare turned it into something very toxic and also turned it into something that bred several generations of males who absolutely cannot function well unless they're surrounded by 2 to 10 or more women at all times. And I think this is fed into, I think this breeding pattern, which I believe was probably created by war, I believe it's helped to feed into this situation where we have an overpopulated planet, thousands of kids getting beat up, molested, or raped. Even though thousands of men pile up in the prisons every day, you still have thousands of women and children getting raped. And that's on both sides of the ocean, and including in Africa and India too. And in Africa they rape little boys too, just like they do here in America, and it's not a rare problem. And with white people it's not a rare problem either, but everybody already knows that because white people actually make an effort to be more vocal about combating it. See, white people, like people of color, tend to look at white people like as if they're more monogamous and as if they're more prone to incest and raping children and doing gay shit. And that's not necessarily true. White people are not necessarily more monogamous or more incestuous. The issue is white people are trying to better themselves, and they are trying to intentionally do things that maybe might help them to come up the evolutionary ladder a little bit. I'm not saying all white people are doing that, because you still have some that fit the white mammy dynamic, where if they're in a cult or in a small religious community and some dude has multiple wives and he's impregnating his daughters too, when you have situations like that, the whole community will cover it up a lot of times because white people have mammies too. Not all white people are on board with the push to evolve our human society, so we're not breeding like ants and consuming the land like locusts. So they don't, like, a lot of times people of color, their way of looking at the white community tends to be very wrong. And then people of color think that monogamy is the root of a lot of problems with women and children being hurt. And that's just not true. In polygamous nations, you have huge problems with children, little girls and boys as young as 4 and 5 years old getting raped. And you got issues with incest. You got issues with women being raped, getting their heads cut off. It's those types of problems are not caused by monogamy. The difference is that the nations that try to push monogamy as part of a genetic weeding out process, those tend to be the nations that are more vocal about the problem. And those tend to be the nations where you have a tiny fraction of a chance at moving into a neighborhood or a city where women and men who are incestuous or who rape children can actually be removed from the community and sent to prison for 20 years so they cannot breed. This is a natural selection process, and I believe it is a successful process because although America has been brutally battered by climate change like everybody else, the overpopulation and the inbreeding problems are not quite as severe here in America because of the culture that has been pushed, because of the selective breeding that has been pushed, but not consistently and not extensively and not in all locations. Because again, there are still a lot of white mammy religious communities and also black mammy communities. And, I don't know about Asians, but I do know there's also Mexican mammy religious communities that do actively protect men who molest or rape little elementary school through teenage age little boys. They protect the men who do it to little girls because everything is all about image. And when you have a family or a city or a community whose image looks a little bit too perfect, then that's how you know there's probably some foul shit, a lot of narcissism, sexual perversion, and human rights violations. If you're living in a city or a neighborhood or a religious community and the reputation there just a little bit too perfect, they're hiding some ultra dark shit and not even trying to elevate themselves nor anyone else's race either through the natural selective process established by law, which we all know that the Mammy Brigade and their men, they have skewed the law and abused the law to the point of subjecting our entire nation to a severe judgment. Ignorance is not bliss. Ignorance can get a whole nation wiped out. And people don't like that, but some of the anomalies and unprecedented disasters that we've seen on holidays are proof that ignorance is not bliss, and ignorance can get a whole city or a whole nation wiped off the fucking map. We are not supposed to be striving for ignorance like the Christian church says, because even in the book of Revelation, it says even the Christian church does not have an indefinite period of time to never be judged. And also the book of Acts chapter 5 makes it crystal clear that a saved, sanctified, Holy Ghost-filled Christian can get judged and can also die on the spot in church. And that's in the book of Acts chapter 5 in the New Testament. So these Christians who say that you can be saved and also never get judged, and never be harmed from a judgment, if they say that, not only does that mean that they did not read their Bible, that also means that the true Ruach HaKodesh, the true Holy Spirit, was never with them to begin with at any point of time, even if they do have power, even if you do see miracles, if they're telling you that you're never supposed to get judged under any circumstances and that you can never get hurt in church, then all those miracles that they're doing, that is not coming from the original Ruach HaKodesh, which is the original Holy Spirit of the New Testament. That's not, they have power, but that's not the source of their power. Because again, you can look at the book of Acts chapter 5 and see where Ananias and his wife Sapphira both dropped dead in the church. So they were saved, sanctified, Holy Spirit-filled Christians, and they both died in church together, and they were a married couple. You know, in the book of Revelation, it says, I will destroy them who destroy the earth. You know, the Bible talks about how, you know, there's going to be a weeding out to separate the wheat from the tares, you know, meaning to separate those who are the true individuals, the true Christians versus those who are just a bunch of weeds popping up. And I'm not saying I have all the answers. I'm not saying I have it all together, because I don't. There are a lot of things I'm still trying to figure out. But what I'm saying is, there's a problem. There's always been problems. It was not caused by Christianity like these people say. It was not caused by monogamy like a lot of people say. And the women who actively protect male and female pedophiles, including male pedophiles who rape little boys, the females who do these things, they're some of the main people who will sit there and telling you, oh yeah, God never judges anybody, and it's okay if a man wants to suck a little dick. Nobody can tell us how to live. I'm like, okay, well, nobody told anyone how to live. And so now our earth is dying above and below the oceans. And if we're not careful, these same people who have done the very things that I'm talking about, they'll be sitting in a desert full of dead trees, just like in the Namib Desert, just like in the Sahara Desert, where sand dunes cover the dead trees. If we're not careful, everybody who pushed in favor of evolution away from their lifestyle will be gone. If we're not careful, we'll be gone, especially the females. They'll get rid of our ass first. The minute there's a total breakdown of society, you know goddamn well they gonna purge our ass first if we're not standing lined up to eat some pussy and to stay on our knees taking abuse, taking neglect, taking recurring infections, or just taking being piled up on a bunch of females. You know, if we don't line up for that, they gonna purge our asses first. And if we're not careful, we can very easily get a scenario like what you have in the Sahara and the Namib Desert, that were both very green and beautiful at one time before human civilization hit it. You know, a matter of fact, the African northern white rhino just recently went extinct a couple of months ago, and he died in the arms of a black man who was cradling him. It's projected that elephants might be extinct in another 10 to 12 years. And of course, our people are blaming it on the Chinese. They're blaming it on white people. But the fact of the matter is, there are a lot of changes that our people have been refusing to make for a long, long time. And our people would not be desperate enough and starving enough to be killing these creatures off down to the point of extinction and crowding them out if our men especially would have got off their fucking ass and embraced the changes that most males in our race have refused to make for thousands of years. If they would have made the changes that they don't want to make, then our people would not be impoverished enough or narcissistic enough or desperate enough to be killing these animals off down to the point of extinction and gradually crowding them out. You can't put all the blame on China and Europe. Are the Chinese getting on boats to go to Africa and shoot down all these elephants themselves? No, they're paying you to do it. They're paying you to do it. And you're desperate enough to keep doing this shit, destroying the land, driving these creatures to extinction and crowding them out and hunting them for body parts. You're desperate enough to do it. Why? Because there's specific basic changes that we have not wanted to make with intent to help our people evolve. And it doesn't always have to be prison. It doesn't always have to be cutting somebody's head off. But it does, but it can involve. I'm not even going to say what I'm thinking right now. I'm not going to say it. I'll just save that for another video on another day. I'm not even going to say it. But anyway, getting back to the polygamy issue, I'm trying to make it crystal clear that the issues of overpopulation, the rape of children, including the gay rape of little boys on both sides of the ocean in multiple polygamous and allegedly monogamous cultures, it is not caused by monogamy. It is not caused by Christianity. It was not caused by white people. That is just an illusion because they have more people, especially more women, who are willing to be vocal about exposing shit with the hope that maybe the government might back them up and start putting certain individuals in jail so they cannot breed. You put somebody in jail for 20 years, if they're young, you gotta risk that they're gonna still come out and have a family. If they're older, like in their 20s, 30s, or 40s, and they go to jail for 20 years for doing some shit, okay, well, you got a tiny chance, just a tiny sliver of a chance that they're not gonna be dropping babies when they get out. Now, another thing about the whole polygamy issue is that Sadhguru was saying, the guy I mentioned at the beginning of my video, he was saying that polygamy works better when all of the women are constantly pregnant and breastfeeding. Okay? And this is a significant point because when a woman is not constantly pregnant and breastfeeding, that means she has more of a chance for her hormones to balance out and to normalize, and she's going to be craving sex. She's going to be craving emotional intimacy, physical intimacy. She's going to be want to have her relationship affirmed by effort, investment of time, and if necessary, money too. Now, if a polygamist is keeping all of his women almost constantly pregnant, he's making sure that they're not going to leave him. And if you do the math, let's say on average, if you have a period of 1 year of pregnancy and 4 years of breastfeeding, that's 5 years that he's going to keep a woman locked down and not leaving him off of a pregnancy, okay? And let's say even if she doesn't breastfeed, let's say it's 1 year of pregnancy plus the 4 years of that child wearing her out and making her exhausted with all the work she has to do in addition to raising the child. Okay, let's say that's still an average of 5 years, right? So when you do the math, okay, when you do the math, let's say a polygamist has 10 wives and 100 children, which is actually pretty standard. If he's white, he might have like 13 wives and 200 children, okay, if he's white. But anyway, let's say you got a standard polygamist. He's got 10 wives and 100 children, right? That means each individual wife is producing on average 10 children each, right? All right, so if you have 5 years of lockdown, exhaustion, and suppressed hormones for each of those 10 babies, multiply each one by 5. 10 multiplied by 5 gives you 50. So by impregnating each individual woman with 10 years, he has locked down and monopolized 50 years of her reproductive cycle. Okay, that means if he's a pedophile and he married her at 12 years old or 9 years old, or, married her when she was pretty young, and if he's keeping her pregnant and breastfeeding constantly, where the minute the baby is weaned or the minute the child's old enough to fend for itself a little bit, and her hormones are going to, and her energy levels going to be returning to normal in about 4 or 5 years. Okay, well, if you do the math, then that means he's re-impregnating her the minute she stops breastfeeding for 4 years, or the minute the child is old enough to fend for itself and she's not exhausted after 5 years. Okay, so you do the math. 10 children multiplied by 5 years each. That means that's 50 total years of her reproductive cycle completely monopolized until she hits menopause. So that right there tells you that these men, they know what they're doing. When they are a polygamist, they keep everyone constantly pregnant intentionally because, again, that's going to suppress their hormones and suppress their energy levels enough through exhaustion where they're not going to be thirsty for a younger man who can perform better in bed. They're not going to be thirsty for someone who can love them better. They're not going to be thirsty sexually for someone who maybe won't beat the shit out of them or use them for their money or use them to do most of the work. They're not going to be thirsting, craving the sex and attention if he's monopolizing her reproductive cycle like that. That's why you have so many polygamists in Utah, America, or in Africa who has 100 children and has 10 children per each woman, because that creates a monopoly, okay? And if it's a woman who's overweight and just naturally has lower energy levels, okay, then he doesn't have to try as hard to wear her out because her poor health and obesity is already going to make her have a lower sex drive and lower energy. So if it's a woman who's overweight and just naturally has the lower sex drive, lower energy, and less robustness in her health, okay, well, he does not have to work as hard at keeping her reproductive cycle locked down. He can keep her exhausted with maybe 5 kids each. Okay, maybe 6 kids each, So, you have some polygamists, they might have like 5 or 6 wives and 30 children. So right there, that's like 5, 6 children each if he's got 30 kids, right? And so right there, he's dialed his math back, and he's only given her 5 children or 6 instead of 10 because he knows that if she's overweight and if she has poor health, he don't have to try as hard to keep her locked down so she won't leave. So that is like one of the basic tenets of a polygamous lifestyle. Most of the time, he does have to keep the women pregnant almost constantly because if they're not exhausted and if they're not hormonally suppressed, through being overworked or by being knocked up excessively in breastfeeding, if they're not suppressed through these different factors, then yeah, they're going to want to leave at some point. They're going to want more sex that maybe he cannot provide. And they're going to want more love and more emotional intimacy that he cannot keep up with. And the adjustment that the polygamist community is making in order to try to compensate for that inability to keep up with a number of women, because they're not almost constantly pregnant, what they do to compensate for that is they're trying to encourage more women to be lesbian or to be bisexual instead of using a sex toy, okay? And there's this big push for LGBTQ lifestyle. It's been gaining momentum for a lot of years, but there's a much bigger push for that gay lifestyle now. Why? Okay, well, if you're making a much bigger push for the LGBTQ lifestyle, that this can allow them to eliminate a hell of a lot of male competition without having to send police to gun them down on the street. This could help eliminate a lot of male competition without having to put them in prisons. If they're laid up sucking on their homeboy's dick, fucking each other in the ass, and refusing to compromise on their standard, which is to have a woman with wealth, a lot of beauty, or white privilege, or feature similar to a white woman, like the nose and whatnot. If they're sucking each other's dick and refusing to compromise on those standards, then this eliminates them as competition as far as access to females goes. And also, if they're trying to train little girls and little boys from a young age to be gay or bisexual, because this will remove younger males as competition. Younger males will not compete with them. Younger males will not report them to the police when they're monopolizing underage girls. Like, teenage boys are not going to fight back and fight to have older male pedophiles arrested. They're not going to do that if they're too busy laid up sucking their best friend's dick and just fucking each other in the ass. They're not going to compete to have a girlfriend. They're not going to fight to have pedophiles arrested so they can get access to girls if they're just fucking other little boys. This is the mindset, this move to condition little boys to be okay with bisexuality and homosexuality from a young age. This is to be sure that they will not pose competition nor a threat of incarceration towards older men who are addicted to girls who are way too young for their old ass. And teaching the girls to be lesbian and bisexual, again, this serves the same purpose. If the women are not almost constantly pregnant throughout the remainder of their reproductive cycle, like what you would see in Africa, or what you would see in Utah, white America, if they're not almost constantly pregnant and breastfeeding and exhausted with raising smaller, younger children, okay, then they're going to have a much higher sex drive, especially if they're healthy and they're not overweight. So they need these women to get hooked on and addicted to gay and bisexual sex practices to compensate for the fact that one man cannot sexually satisfy multiple women if they're not pregnant, breastfeeding, and raising children under the age of 6 in close succession over and over and over again. If the women are not being monopolized like that, if they're not being overworked, if they're not being excessively pregnant, if they're not overweight and unhealthy, then he needs her to make bisexuality or lesbianism a habit in order to attempt to decrease the probability that she's going to leave and go to some other guy who's going to respect her, who's going to love her, who's going to treat her like she's worth something instead of beating the shit out of her and treating her like she's a fucking dog to obey. Okay? Like, if they can train and mentally condition the women to be more bisexual and lesbian, this takes away a lot of the work of keeping these women locked down if they're not constantly pregnant and overworked with very young, small kids. You know, but like I said, with fat women, it's different, because when you're fatter, your sex drive can be a little lower, and, you know, if you got health issues, yeah, your sex drive can be lower. And so these men, they do teach each other these things. They do know these things. As a woman, are they going to teach you? No. Are they going to tell you the types of things that I'm telling you in this video? No. Because they want to forcibly continue the addiction to the wartime lifestyle of having several women at home waiting for you. They also don't want to selectively remove men from access to breeding if they're more likely to become a rapist, if they have a history of molesting little boys or molesting little girls. They don't want to remove those men and women from the breeding pool. They don't. Like, you know, the people who have not been sexually deprived for long periods of time and will still do fucked up shit anyway. Okay, you could have a dude who has 10 wives in Utah, and this has happened, where one of those dudes had 10 wives and was still repeatedly impregnating one of his own daughters because she was young and attractive. You know, having those 10 women did not deter him from repeatedly getting his daughter pregnant over and over again. Then when she ran, he had the young men trying to track her down to bring her back, like with some mafia style shit. So with that said, the men who are laws in our culture is supposed to remove from the breeding pool, a lot of times they don't get removed because people they don't know and also don't care about all the reasons why they should be in favor of the practices. You know, and then you have a lot of people, they abuse it, where they're like, oh, okay, if you're white like me, I'm not going to report you, white power. If you're black like me, I'm not going to report you, black power. And so then you have all these people who are multiplying and creating a very real problem through their genetics or through their attitude or some combination of the two. You know, there are men in this world who don't need to have 10 wives and 111 children genetically, like the Ayata men of the mountains in the Philippines. They've changed a lot from interbreeding with people from other places, but originally they were indigenous, dark-skinned, nappy-headed Asians with afros who were from there and not brought there through slavery. Ayata men, they don't go bald in old age like a chimpanzee, okay, because they're more hormonally calm. They have gender equality. They're women, or should I say gender equity. Traditionally, Ayata men had gender equity, not equality. Equity means that even though the two genders are not equals physically, women still had rights. They still had access to respect. They had access to being valued. They had access to being loved. They had access to rights. They had gender equity. Okay? And Ayata men, they're nomadic. Traditionally, they did not keep strangleholds on tiny territories. They were highly nomadic. They would marry young, and they might stay with that one woman their whole life, or they might switch partners. But either way it goes, they would get married, they partner up, and just live a nomadic lifestyle. They had lower rates of incest. Okay? And it's kind of a rare and special thing to find communities outside America that have lower rates of incest. Now in the Islamic community of England, you see the opposite. In the Islamic community of England, you have more than half of them married to a first cousin. But with Ayatollah men, you don't have that. You have gender equity. You have a nomadic lifestyle. They're more monogamous. They don't go bald in old age like a chimpanzee because they're more hormonally calm. They don't fight to keep strangleholds over territories or jobs or resources. So I'm saying this to say that the original Ayatollah men who have not done all that recent mixing with Spaniards and Chinese, they are Black men. They're indigenous to the mountains of the Philippines. They did not get there through slavery. And they are genetically and culturally, if I'm not misinformed, they're genetically and culturally less intense. They're not, I don't know what they're doing now. I'm talking about the older generations. I don't know what they're doing now. Now they've been heavily mixing with all them Chinese and Spaniards. But, the older generation Ayatollah men of the Philippines, they are proof that men who are more hormonally calm and who don't go bald in old age like a chimpanzee, men who don't build harems who are more monogamous, men who don't produce tsunamis of female children, who practice more sharing, men who have much lower rates of incest and inbreeding, men who tend to be more nomadic and who don't fight to hold on to small territories. The Ayatollah men are proof that those types of Black males do exist. They are real. But yet, to let the white community and to let the Black American and the African American community tell it, they want you to believe that it's not possible to do selective breeding to choose a male who is less of a problem genetically and culturally. And also choosing the males, whether it's through a sperm bank or through marriage, whatever, choosing the males who are less of a problem culturally or genetically, that does not make a nation weaker. That does not necessarily make a nation weaker at all. And the Chinese are not genetically like the Ayatollah men. They have to forcibly create a larger male population through abortions. India, they're not like the Ayatollah men genetically either. That's why they do the female abortions. That's why in India you had the situation with a lady getting gang raped on a city bus. In China, you got situations with them keeping females in chains as slaves because there are not enough females to go around. You have situations like that because they're genetically not like the Ayatollah men who they've more recently started mixing with. They're not like them at all. And a lot of their social policies, they do these things in an attempt to try to decrease the problems with the population. And a lot of times it doesn't even really work, just like what you see here in America. And, and as a woman who is the product of a grandfather who had a full head of hair till the day he died because he was a hormonally calmer male, but growing up in a more dysfunctional culture that is nothing like Ayatollah culture. Okay, as a woman who's a product of a male, a Black man who's genetically less of a problem, even though he was doing a lot of foul shit because of his culture, I know that back home there are other women like me. I know that back home there are other women blacker and darker than myself, women who have more indigenous American ancestry than me, or women who have none at all. But back home, they've given birth to very few female children. Very, very, very few females. Like when I, and this has been going on for a long time. Like even when I was born, I was the only female baby in the nursery. So I know back home, there are other people who come from bloodlines like mine. You know, I also know that sometimes those genetics can skip over a child. Like one of my brothers, his hairline started receding in his 20s, like a white dude. So I know genetically, my brother, the oldest of my two younger brothers, I know he's not going to be compatible with a lifestyle that is more peaceful, with very little warfare, with gender equity, and higher levels of monogamy. I know he's not going to be compatible with that lifestyle because his hairline started receding in his 20s like a white man. He's not going to be, I know that particular brother, he's not going to be compatible in that kind of environment at all. You know, he needs to be in a neighborhood, in a place like America where men are mass incarcerated and mass murdered. He needs that. He needs the almost constant nonstop wars because, you know, the genes from granddad skipped over him. And I know the genes from granddad didn't skip over me because I don't have any daughters. All of my stolen children are little boys. And then the people who had the genes to skip over them in the white race and the black race, they took my sons from me and then both races started raping them as soon as they were old enough to walk. People probably think I'm crazy. They probably think I'm making this shit up. And I'm not. They didn't solely just do it to my sons as soon as they were old enough to walk. They did the same things to both fathers of my children. With both fathers of my children, that people of both races was raping them soon as they turned 5, gay raping them soon as they turned 5. I met someone who might be my twin flame or my twin ray. And same thing with him. But the only difference is he had a female that was molesting him soon as he turned 10. And you have that too, where you got a grown woman or teenager and she run around having sex with little boys in the family. You know, so with that said, you have some people, you can give them access to sex on a regular basis. With some men, you know, you can give them access to sex on a regular basis. Some women, and they're still gonna try to mess with little kids. They're still gonna overpopulate. They're still gonna do fuck shit. That exists. They don't have to be celibate and deprived for months or years at a time. They could be celibate and deprived for 10 minutes or an hour and still do it. Some individuals are like that. You know, and like I said, I think it's not right for Black people and also the white community, and even now a lot of mestizos in the mestizo community, they want everybody to think that bloodlines like mine don't exist. You know, and then even within a bloodline like mine, you still have individuals like the older of my two brothers where those genes just skip them completely. And their hairline's receding. Soon as they hit their 20s, they're losing hair. You know, those are the guys who need more of that polygamy and overpopulation and mass murder of men. And as long as we as women are choosing to breed, to mate, to reproduce with the men who go bald in old age, with the men who are not as hormonally calm, with the men who are addicted to the wartime culture and addicted to the image of having several females waiting for them to come home, as long as we continue to breed with those types of men, we are not going to have stable populations. Okay, we're not going to have stable populations that don't expand excessively until we stop doing that. You know, as women, we have to be more adamant about pushing change culturally and in our reproductive practices. In, you know, preventing a baby, it doesn't even have to involve abortion. There's, even if there's no access to condoms, even if there's no access to birth control pills, there are herbs like pokeweed and herbs like Queen Anne's lace, where if you know how to safely identify those herbs and if you know how to safely use those plants, that you can forage from a parking lot, forage from weeds in your backyard, or forage from almost anywhere, or grow it in a garden. If you know how to safely use those types of plants, you can end an early pregnancy before you even miss your period, or you can end it on the day that your period is due, one or the other, if you know what you're doing. And, you know, these guys, we keep playing with them and bowing to them, but they're not playing with us. You go to India, your parents can kill you for not being what they want you to be. You go to the Islamic nations, your parents can kill you if you're a female and you're not being what they want you to be. You're not being the product they want to sell. You come to America and you have Black men murdering Black women at much higher rates than what white men do. It's pretty common to look on the news and hear about a white man who murdered a woman who he picked up on a date, or a white man who murdered his girlfriend, or a white man who murdered his wife. It's common to turn on the TV and hear about that, but you don't hear about Black men doing it. You don't hear about that because Black men, they are willing to purge us. They are willing to sacrifice us, and they have been doing it at extremely high rates for a very long time. And this is a problem that goes all the way back to Africa. And it didn't even start with Islam or Abrahamic religions either. You know, with in Kenya and in some other African nations, and I know this because my ex-husband told me, you know, my ex-husband was African. You know, in Kenya, what men would do, the male polygamists, what they would do is they would leave newborn children in the wilderness to be eaten by wild animals if they were born deformed from the gene pool narrowing, from them monopolizing so many women, you know, or cheating a lot if enough females were not available for a harem. So when the babies would come out deformed, they'll just let wild animals eat them. And in the American Southwest, you would see the same thing here in America in the Southwest, where those tribes, they just drown the baby to death at birth. And so you have this culture where they were willing to kill children and kill women to support their lifestyle and to forcibly push the genetics toward making the men a greater danger to women and children. They were willing to sacrifice women and children to create a bigger problem genetically and socially, okay? They were not willing to sacrifice other men. That's too big of a threat. And even today, even in the Western world, they're not willing to sacrifice the men who rape. They're not willing to sacrifice the men who molest or rape little boys and little girls too. They're not willing to sacrifice the men and women who do that. They're not willing to sacrifice the people who are extremely incestuous. For the most part, most of our society is not willing to sacrifice those types of people. So what do? They've had more than 5 million abortions. And this is a statistic from like 7-8 years ago. So I'm pretty sure the number of abortions we've had since it became legal is much higher than 5 million, okay? Why? Because the culture of sacrificing women, beating women up, killing women, abandoning women, leaving women for dead, subjecting women to narcissistic abuse, gay raping the little boys, raping and molesting the little girls, all that stuff goes all the way back to that ancient culture on both sides of the ocean that involves sacrificing women and sacrificing children in order to push their idea of what the world is supposed to look like. And our planet is dying under the weight of what they've done. And if we want to save our planet, we cannot just say, oh, somebody's going to invent something and it's guaranteed to work. Because guess what? It's not guaranteed to work. And you know that most people are not going to stop breeding willingly, especially not if they're a white supremacist, not if they're a black supremacist, not if they're Islamic, not if they're uneducated, not if they're whatever demographic. Most people are not going to stop breeding in the hope of keeping a stranglehold on power. Most people are not culturally and genetically like Ayatollah men of the Philippines. I mean the originals, not the ones who's mixed with the Spaniards and Asians now. Most people are not like that. And, World War III might be coming to do a depopulation so that, farmers can have time to rebuild the soils on the mega farms. But even though a depopulation might be coming, how many of our men might we lose? Men of color who are not a problem genetically, but maybe just more of a problem culturally and in their mentality. How many white men might we lose who are less of a problem genetically, but maybe just more of a problem culturally and in their mentality? Like with the war coming to depopulate, to what extent are we going to lose men and women who are less of a problem? People who fit that genetic profile, they need to be on a battlefield fighting each other. They do. Because when they're not on a battlefield taking each other out, then we get situations like this where they're killing off the more hormonally calm men of color. They're isolating and crowding out the more hormonally calm women of color who don't birth tsunamis of females. We have these situations where they're able to snuff out the people who's less of a problem because they're trying to set it up where they never have to fight with each other. They never have to fight to the death with each other, which is more in line with what happens in nature. In nature, every creature has to fight its own kind for territory, and because they're not fighting their own kind for territory, we have the mega farm soils almost about to collapse and be exhausted soon in the next 40, 50 years if they don't start World War III. Because they're not fighting their own kind, but focused on snuffing us out, crowding us out, and stealing our kids. We have this situation where ecosystems are collapsing above and below the oceans. And a lot of times the main people who are the main root of this problem, you'll see them saying things like, oh, all we got to do is just plant a tree and we just can plant trees and that's going to magically make everything go away. Or you'll hear them saying things like, oh, climate change is not real and the earth is flat. Or you'll hear them saying things like, oh, well, these problems are not that bad. animals have not gone extinct to the extent that they say, and it's just white people's fault, it's just the Chinese people's fault, and if we could just live in mud huts in a village, we wouldn't have this problem if we could just do the old ways. And right there, like, the issue is you really cannot tell them anything. You can't. Because if you try to tell them anything, they'll twist it into something ugly. They'll twist it into something nasty. They'll blame it on somebody else instead of looking in the mirror. And then they'll turn around and say, oh, well, these issues you're bringing up are not real. They'll say these issues you're bringing up don't exist. You know, and it's not just black people. White people are doing it too. The same shit you see Negroes doing wrong, white folks doing the same shit wrong too. And matter of fact, they're the main offenders on the North American continent for the overpopulation. But every time you turn on a TV, every time you open a book, they're talking about the white birth dearth. They're talking about there's not enough white babies. When the truth is, black people are less than 12% of the population. North American natives who are not mestizos are way less than 1% of the population. You know, when you look at the white community and also the Mexican mestizo community, and even like Cherokee mestizo communities and Creek mestizo community, when you look at that, it is painfully obvious that there is no shortage of white babies. But then they sitting there doing the same thing black people are doing wrong, where you can't tell them nothing. If you say anything to them, they'll twist it into something ugly and nasty and run to do the opposite. And then they want to lie and blame the shit on somebody else. You got black people doing it, and you got white people lying and blaming this shit on somebody else, where they done laid up and bred like ants, just like these Africans. But every time you turn on a TV or open a book, they're saying, oh, there's a dearth of white babies. We don't have enough children being born. Every time you see a white guy who wants to be a mass shooter or who wants to steal millions of dollars from other white people to support his 10 wives and 200 children, you hear him saying the same thing, like, oh, there's not enough white babies. Like, bullshit. Bullshit. And originally, this country was not white anyway. This America started out as a melting pot. You had the Asian community to the north. You had the Black Olmec community from Africa and from Australia to the south. And then you had white merchant nomads who would travel back and forth across the ocean selling drugs like marijuana and cocaine. America was a melting pot 20,000, 40,000 years ago. And these people who you refer to as Native Americans, they're the children of mixed people who had to leave their tribes and be with each other. That's the ugly truth. But the individuals who a lot of times tends to be at the root of a lot of problems, they're not going to listen to their ancestors who tell them that. They're not going to listen to a scholar or an elder who tells them that. A lot of times the people who are at the root of a lot of problems and who know for a fact that they're at the root of a lot of problems and not admitting it, they will fight you and swear up and down that the shit is not true and that you don't belong among them if you're not denying that reality. And what I know to be true is that we have this issue with the men of color and the women of color being snuffed out and crowded out because the people who are genetically or culturally more likely to be trying to have 10 wives and 100 children or 13 wives and 26 children, the people who are more likely genetically or culturally to be doing that, they have not been willing to fight each other to the death on the battlefield. They have not been willing to compete with each other. They have not been willing to keep each other out of specific opportunities. They have not been willing to oppress each other. And that's why we have this situation where we've got overpopulation of whites in America. We have overpopulation of mestizos. We have overpopulation of Africans in Africa, overpopulation of Asians in Asia who are not like the Ayatollah men. Why? Because they are not willing, they want to live by jungle law, but only the parts of jungle law that is convenient. If you're trying to live by jungle law instead of divine law, if you know that you genetically or culturally need those 10 women who's going to produce anywhere from 20 to 200 babies, if you know that you're from that kind of demographic and you are not fighting each other to the death for territory, but instead you're going to prey on the smaller ethnic groups and from the less numerous bloodlines it's not like you are not a natural creature. You are, from the nature spirit point of view, you are an aberration and an abomination from the nature spirit point of view, because that is not natural. If you are an elderly man with very young fertile mates and several children, you are not natural from the nature spirit point of view. You are an aberration and also an abomination, because in nature, your ass would have been dead and been killed by a younger, more healthier male. When you are an aged male, it is your destiny to fall and to die if you are from a more polygamous dynamic. That is how you are supposed to die for population control. You are supposed to be killed by a younger, stronger male from a bloodline like yours. You're not supposed to overpopulate and then prey on the smaller populations, the less numerous ones that's not like you. That's not how it works in nature. There is nothing natural about you. And if you prevent the World War III and you send the men and women who are not like you genetically or culturally to die on the front lines, you are promoting an abomination that is not natural. You're supposed to be fighting others who are not like you. If you want to live by jungle law, then you have to die by jungle law. That's, like the Bible says, if you live by the sword, you die by the sword. And likewise, if you live by the penis, probability is really high that you're going to die by the penis. Whether that's through disease and your access to condoms and medication getting cut off, or whether that's through dying in childbirth, or whether it's through your soils being so exhausted and so depleted of nutrients that now your mega farms cannot supply your grocery stores in 50 or 60 years from now. See, that's an example of living by the penis and dying by it. And that's all I have to say about what men and their mammies of all four races typically are usually not going to tell you about polygamy.